Gary, can we get your perspective on aligning business practice to better ensure inmates safely reintegrate into the community?
Yeah, from my perspective, what we were very successful in doing and what the Transition from Jail to the Community initiative requires is a system orientation, thinking about jail or prison inmates as members of the community and figuring out among all the various community stakeholders how to best get them integrated back into the community and integrate all our services so that they're all aligned in best interest of long-term public safety.
Thank you, Gary. Ms. McCoy, would you like to add your thoughts about this question?
Well, I think first and foremost, integrating the principles of effective interventions, especially when we're talking about separating high and low risk offenders, which of course requires assessment or classification of the inmates. Secondly, to provide cognitive behavioral programs and services that address criminal thinking and criminal behavior is real important. And then also hiring and training staff that are able to model pro-social behaviors. As we all know, we learn a lot by watching others, and so hiring and seeking out staff who can model what we want, the desired behavior that we want from them is very important. And then establishing positive relationships with community partners, because when they do go home to the home community, we need to have relationships with those folks that will make the transition smooth and effective.
Thank you, Cindy. We'd like to now move to the next question and ask our panelists, what does the real-world application of evidence-based principles and practices look like as offenders transition into the community? Cindy, why don't we start with your thoughts and then go to Gary?
Well, I remember several years ago when we had our first reentry person. We didn't know it at the time, but in effect that is what we were doing. And this inmate had served over 20 years in a prison facility. And when he came back, we started to work with him on the things that we wanted to work with him about. And some of the things that I noticed is that, he would make comments about, he did not know what, for instance, self-serve gasoline pumps were. And he wasn't familiar with technology such as cell phones and couldn't really comprehend the concept of even buffets in a restaurant. And so, there's some basic things, I think, that, we want to keep in mind, especially these folks who have served, a long time. I had previously mentioned risk and needs assessment, making sure that there's a thorough assessment of their needs, not wanting to rely on the work that was done prior to prison, because hopefully the prison staff would have addressed some of those needs already. But we need to identify the needs to be addressed, and then prioritizing those, which are the ones to address first, versus on down the line, and sort of sorting out what's the priority in terms of, if they don't have a place to live, they're not going to have, stability to really respond to others. And of course, always remembering that we need to respond to criminal thinking and a criminal orientation as a very high priority. Family, including family and significant others, we've noticed a large number coming back who have particular problems with children and visiting children when the children are in custody of, ex-spouses and other family members and that sort of thing, and they are very concerned about that. So, obviously very important to address those issues as well.
Thank you, Cindy. That was very informative. Gary, we'd like to get your thoughts now about real-world application of the evidence-based principles and practices.
Sure, Kate. To me, everything that Cindy said is really important. All the foundational information, and to ensure that you're doing and applying everything in the context of all the now very extensive literature that's out there relative to evidence-based practice. But I mean, really, the most important, and Cindy alluded to it, the real-world application of evidence-based practice requires us to look at ourselves, the practitioners, and interact and act with the clients, inmates, defendants, whatever you are calling them, as we would expect them to act. And if you think about the way we interact often with inmates, clients, defendants, again, whatever you would call them, sometimes we get frustrated with them and we don't interact with them the way we would expect them to interact with others. And that really is quite a detriment. We can't do that, frankly, and then expect them to respond differently because they go to one or two classes, and regardless of whether the classes are evidence-based or not. So it really, in terms of the real world, we really need to think about the whole thing and employ the inmate, again, inmate, defendant, offender, whatever the person is called, as a full working partner in this whole aspect of jail transition, and engage them in their own plan to get better and transition successfully.
You know, another thing I might add too is that's sometimes hard for staff is the actual practice of skills. In other words, role modeling, refusing, being approached to consume alcohol or drugs. And I know in our probation department reentry program, that's sometimes been a challenge for staff to actually do role plays and to do things that sort of go outside of their comfort zone of what they would typically do with with an offender.
Such a great point, Cindy, and what Mr. Craig would have talked about in his feature presentation was about the leadership focus that we need to pay attention to in both institutions and in community corrections, and that leadership development is so key to making sure that staff do have the appropriate skills and competencies to be able to do their work differently, as you've both said. We'd also like to talk a little bit about integrated systems of reentry around case planning, as well as transitioning from the institutions into the communities. As we all know, the role of our community stakeholders and the effects of concentrated areas of incarceration on our communities are of a critical importance. We'd like to now ask our panelists, how can community stakeholders collaborate in supporting reform to achieve cost-effective and sustainable reentry practices that ultimately improve public safety and community well-being? Gary, we'd like to start with your thoughts, please.
Boy, that's quite a question, Kate. I would go back to the first part of it. When you start talking about case management and you start talking about integrated actions to manage offender behavior, most systems that I go in do not have systems in place. They may think that they do, but they are not based on a common assessment. They are not based on common foundational premises of case management, and they don't give the same message to the inmate offender. I'm just going to call them offender globally, and you can apply your own name, but they don't give the same or similar even message to the offender. And offenders, being what they are, find that that they don't get the same messages and basically come away with that they don't think the system has their best interests at heart, and they kind of cancel out everything that they've had when they don't have some kind of continuity from system to system. So I mean, most important is that we rely on a common assessment and a common case plan that the inmate is part and parcel to. Such
a good point, Gary, and I can understand that the question certainly had a lot of facets to it. Cindy, would you like to contribute to this question? Again, how can community stakeholders collaborate in supporting reform to achieve cost-effective and sustainable reentry practices?
Well, you know, the reentry collaboration has been a fascinating thing for me to observe, because we've had a collaborative effort in place for several years in the drug court setting. When we attempted to do that in reentry, the challenges that we faced with that is that these folks have been to prison, and so with drug court participants, there's less of a stigma, or there's less of a negative perception out there about the people that we are trying to help and to serve. And so, you know, one of the things I think it's important for us to do on the correction side is to remind stakeholders why it's important that these collaborations take place, particularly when it is so critical that we get it right with these folks, because they are the highest risk people who are going to be returning to the community. And so it makes it that much more imperative that we do the right things with them. And of course, when you're talking about collaboration, we're really talking about making sure that the programs and services are in place that are going to address the risk factors that we previously talked about in terms of assessment.
Thank you, Cindy. Go ahead, Gary.
If I could just jump in there for 1 second. When we talk about this, it's really important for the community stakeholders to recognize their responsibility to understand evidence-based policy and practice and ensure that their practices are constant with what's known to best change offender behavior. And frankly, that's often not the case among treatment providers. They're trained to provide, let's say, substance abuse, but they have no formal training to understand criminogenic risks and needs and what the detrimental effect are of them in terms of high rates of recidivism.
So critically important, Gary, and both of you kind of touched on the fact that as you change those practices to be more evidence-based and aligned with what the research says works, that we also have to feed that information back to staff as well. I believe we have Dan back on the line now. Dan, are you there?
Yes, I am. I apologize.
Wonderful. So what we'd like to do now is just take a step back, and given the information that Gary and Cindy have been able to share with us about community stakeholders and also touching on case planning and as well as culture change, we'd like to go back to your featured presentation and start with the integrated model. And with that, Dan, I'll turn it back over to you.